Okay, so today we are going to continue graphing sine and cosine functions, and we're going to graph them showing some shifts, horizontally or vertically. So let's take a look and see what that standard form looks like, just as a quick reminder. So when we look at this, we have y equals a times sine b theta, and we're going to add plus k here. So as you remember all the different shifts that we've done before, the k gives you that vertical shift. It tells you how much is it moving from the x-axis. And then we talked about the midline. So I never told you what that was before because it's been the origin. But the midline is y equals k. So on the last problems that we had, we didn't have anything added or subtracted when we looked at that parent function. But now we're going to have that where it changes. Okay, a couple other things is determining what a is. The absolute value of that gives you the amplitude. If I can spell, there we go. And then to calculate the period, b helps us with that. To get the period, if it is in degrees, we take 360 and divide it by b. If it's in radians, it's 2 pi divided by b. Okay, so whatever you get from either of those, that gives you your period. All right, so take a look at this first example, and let's think about what we need to do to identify. So I have steps that I go through. The first thing I do is I look at this and I ask myself, what is the midline? If you're given the equation, you can see the midline is y equals k. So that means I need to know what k is. So this gives us the equation for that midline. The next thing I like to get, if I have to graph, is the amplitude. And again, we know the amplitude is equal to whatever a is, the absolute value. It's always going to be positive. It's never going to be negative. And then I want the period so I know how far out I have to go. And so again, remember we said the period, to get that we need to find b. What is b equal to? And then we take 360 over b, or 2 pi over b, to get that period. The last thing I think about is, or it could be, these are the four things, it doesn't matter which order. But I think to myself, is it cosine or is it sine? If I have to graph it, I need to think about where do I start. If I'm given the graph and I have to write the equation, I also have to think about what does it look like. And so what do they look like? Cosine always starts above and then it goes back up. Sine starts here, midline above, midline below, midline, and it just keeps repeating itself. So this is cosine. This is top, bottom, or I'm sorry, top, middle, bottom, middle, top. This is middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. And notice that it always comes back to where it started. So this one here for cosine started at the top, it finishes at the top to get one full cycle. The sine started at the middle and it finishes at the middle to get one full cycle. So because we're looking at sine, I know it's going to be this one here. So let's go ahead and do this problem. So looking at this problem, my midline, I'm going to think of this written differently. You can rearrange it. Think of it as y equals 1/2 times sine, and I'm going to write, instead of theta over 4, I'm going to write it as 1/4 theta. And then the minus 2 up here, the negative 2, I'm going to write it as minus 2 there. So that way it just kind of helps me to see that this is my k, this is my a, this is my b. So since a is equal to 1/2, b is equal to 1/4, and k is equal to -2, that gives me a lot of information I need to graph. So that means my amplitude is equal to 1/2. My midline is y equals -2. That means that the graph is going to go up a half a unit from -2, and it's also going to go down a half a unit from -2. So my period, because we're doing these in degrees, the period is going to equal 360 divided by 1/4, which is the same thing as 360 times 4, which gives me 1440. So this is 1440 degrees. So I know that when I graph this, if you don't have graph paper, put your 5 points on there, and your last point is going to be at 1440. So when I look at this, I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is 1440. You can divide that by 4 and figure out what these here will be. So 1440 divided by 4 gives you 360. I'm going to turn my paper so you can see this in case it's not clear. I'll write it with a darker pen. So this will be 360 degrees. And then if I add another 360 to that, I get 720 degrees. And another 360, I get 1080. And then 1440. Okay, so sometimes students want to write those degrees down here, up here. If it's easier for you, you can just put 360 up here, and then you can put 720 right here, and then you can put 1080 right here, and then 1440 right there. So if it's easier for you so you can see it, you can list them at the top. It really doesn't matter. All right, so let's graph it. We know that we're doing sine. So sine starts at the midline. So our midline, remember, is not going to be at, it's not going to be at 0. It's going to be down here. So I'm going to do it with a dash line at -2. So it's at -2, and so that means I'm going to start on my midline because that's what sine does. And then we're going to go up a half, so middle, then top, and then middle, and then bottom, and that's going to be at -2.5, -2.5, and then middle. And so it's going to look like this. And it's going to come through here, back down, and back up. Make sure you have arrows at each end. If I continued it all the way, then I would go to here, and I'd go to here, and it would just come back and it would follow that same pattern. Okay, so you could keep going. All right, and that is all we had to do. One of the things that I want you to see is that when you're doing sine, it crosses the midline 3 times. So crosses midline 3 times. So once here, and then once here to get that one full cycle. All right, let's look at the second example. The second example, when I look at that, I see that my K is 2. So that means my midline is y equals 2. That's important to know because that's the middle. And then the amplitude is going to tell me how high above that and how low it's going to go. So my amplitude is equal to 3, because the absolute value of 3 is 3. My period, this is B, so I'm going to take 360 and divide it by 3, and I get 120 degrees. But let's do this instead of degree. Oh, these are in radians. So instead of that, I'm going to do 2 pi divided by 3. And that is going to be my period, because we're not doing it in degrees. This one we'll do in radians. Okay, so 2 pi over 3. So let's say that these aren't listed. How would we do it? Well, I would start out and I would just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'm going to put 2 pi over 3. And half of that would take me to here. So half of 2 pi over 3 is pi over 3. And that's enough for me. If you want to fill in the others, you can. You can do half of pi over 3 if you want to and fill in the rest of those. But I'm okay with just giving me that. We know it's cosine, and so cosine is going to start off of the midline. So our amplitude is 3. Instead of starting on the midline, we're going to start 1, 2, 3 up here. So remember, it's top, middle, bottom, middle, top. So top, and then we're going to come down here to the middle. Then we're going to come to the bottom. Oops, that's not the bottom because it's supposed to be down 1, 2, 3. So it should be here. Let's fix that. Okay, so it's going to be here. And then we're going to go back to the middle. And then we're going to go up to the top. Okay. So we're going to draw that in. Now, if I said to continue, could you continue that? I hope so, because you should be able to. So even though this is one cycle, if I said to fill in the whole coordinate plane, then you would just follow that pattern and you'd say, okay, I'm going to go back down to the middle, back to the bottom, back to the middle, back to the top. And so it would look like this. And following that, just giving you, sometimes you'll be asked to graph 2 cycles or 3 cycles, and so you just continue following that same pattern. Okay, I think we've answered all the questions for that one. Let's move on to this next one. This is cosine. So cosine starts off of the midline. So let's go ahead and identify some important pieces. Our A gives us 2, our B gives us 3, and our K is -2. And we have cosine. So looking at that, my amplitude is equal to 2. That means we're going to have 2 units above and below the midline. My midline is y equals -2. And my period, in this case we're doing it in radians. So in radians, it's going to be 2 pi divided by 3. So 2 pi divided by 3, we can't reduce that. So then we're going to graph this. Okay, so when I did the notes, I just put in a random graph, and so that's why those values are not correct. All right, so when we're looking at the 5-point summary, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's where my cycle's going to end. And it's going to end at 2 pi over 3. Half of that would be pi over 3. Again, if you want to fill in these 2, you can go ahead and calculate them, but I'm okay as long as you have those 2. I know that my period stops right here. We'll go ahead and go to that period, and then we'll just finish it off from there. All right, my midline, I like to draw that in. And since we're talking about cosine, we're going to start off of the midline. So we're going to start how much above. The amplitude tells me how much above. It's 2. So we're going to count up 1, 2, and we're going to start right here. And then remember, cosine is top, middle, bottom, middle, top. So we start here, and then we come down to the middle, and then we go down to the bottom, we come back to the middle, and up to the top. And that gives us one full cycle. Now let's go ahead and finish this off so that it completes our graph. So then we're going to go back down to the middle, back down to the bottom, back to the middle, and up to the top. And so you can see that it follows that same pattern. Okay, I think that we've answered everything. It doesn't ask you for domain and range, but our domain would be all real numbers because it continues in both directions. Our range would be -4 as our low, and our high would be 0. And if you remember interval notation, you can write that for your range. And that would be okay. All right, looking at the 4th one here. Go ahead and give this one a try on your own. We're going to do this also in radians. Okay, so try this one and go ahead and pause your video and try it, and then come back on and see if your answer matches mine. Okay, so take a look and see how did you do. So I started out and I recognized my amplitude is 1/2. My value for B is 2. So I took 2 pi and divided by 2 and got pi. So that means I would go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this would be pi. This would be pi over 2. If you wanted to put pi over 4 here, you can, and 3 pi over 4 here, that's fine. We're graphing this with an amplitude of 1/2, and cosine always starts above the midline, so start at 1/2. So there's our top, our middle, our bottom, our middle, our top, and if we just kept going, you can see what that looks like. Domain in this case would be all real numbers. I know this isn't asking it, but it's good for practice. Domain is all real numbers. And then range, our low is -2.5, and our high is -1.5, and it includes both of those. So you can use the interval notation if you would like. Okay, and let's flip this over and see what we have on the back. We have a few more examples. And on these examples, we're going to actually write the equation. So a little bit different than what we did on the front. We still need to look at it and figure out some things. And those things that we need to figure out are what is the midline and what is the amplitude. That will give us our value for K. It will also give us our value for A. And then figuring out when it repeats helps us to get the period. So as I look at this, the first thing I notice is that halfway in between, here's the high, here's the low, and this is my midline right here. So my midline is at y equals 0. So that tells me that K equals 0. I also notice that I'm starting on the midline. So because I'm starting on the midline, I know it's going to be y equals sine. How far above that midline am I going? What is my A value equal to? Well, it looks like my amplitude is equal to 1/2. So then my A value is either going to be 1/2 or -1/2, because it could be negative. What determines whether it's negative or positive is where we're going. We're going up, we're not going down. If we were going the opposite direction down, then it would be a negative value for A. But we're going up, so it's positive. Again, because the graph starts on the midline, so it starts on the midline. So there's that middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. That tells me it's sine. Okay, so that's how I knew that we had sine here. The next thing we need to notice is, where does our period end? So here, then here, then here, then here, then here. So our middle ends right here. That is our middle, I'm sorry, our period is right there. So that's one full cycle. So if we figure out what that is, I'm noticing that we have 60 here, we have 120 here. So halfway in between here and here would be 90 degrees. So 90 degrees is going to help us, because that tells me what my period is. Period in terms of one complete cycle. So what I need to figure out is, what is B equal to? Now remember that to get the period, which is 90 degrees, we took 360 and we divided it by B. So when I calculate this, to get that, I'm going to find that B is equal to 4. So that helps me with my equation, this helps me with my equation, and this helps me with my equation. So my equation is 1/2 times sine 4 theta. And I don't really need to put that plus 0. And that's our equation right there. All right, let's look at the next one. Is it sine or is it cosine? We're starting, if I look, here's the top, here's the bottom. The midline is halfway in between. So we're starting off the midline. So if we're starting off the midline, it's going to be cosine. So starts off the midline. So since it starts off the midline, I know it's going to be y equals something cosine theta. What is our distance from here to here? Whatever that is, halfway in between is going to be where our midline is. You can calculate it or you can count it. So I'm at 4 and negative 4. So 4 plus a negative 4 divided by 2 gives me the middle. That gives me my midline. And it equals 0. So that means this right here is the middle and it's y equals 0, which means k is equal to 0. So I'm not going to add or subtract anything. So nothing needs to go there. We'll put plus 0 just for emphasis, and then we'll go back and we'll rewrite it without it. So our amplitude is going to tell us how high and how low we're going. So when I look at this from the middle, how high is it from here to here? Because we're starting here and we're going down. So how far is it away from that? 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is 4. So that means that A is equal to 4 because of our amplitude. So our amplitude is equal to 4. Remember, the amplitude helps us with our value for A. Because we're going from top to middle, then we know that it's positive. So this is going to be a positive 4. And then our cosine theta, what's going to go in front of that? Well, this is where we have to figure out our period. So looking at this, top, middle, bottom, middle, top. Right here is where the period ends. And it ends right at pi. So that tells me that my period is equal to pi. Now, remember, to get the period, we would take 2 pi and divide it by b, and that would give us the period. And we said the period is pi. So what is b equal to then? Well, you can multiply and then divide if you want, or you can say, oh, to make this be pi, I'm just going to have b equaling 2. And so now we can put that value for 2, this b equals 2, this here, and we put it in here for 2 theta. The simplest way to write that would be to not have the 0 there. So our answer would be y equals 4 cosine 2 theta. Don't need to put the plus 0. All right, 2 more examples where you're given the graph and you're asked to write the equation. So, is it sine or is it cosine? What is your midline? What is your amplitude? What is the period? So, the first thing I think I would do here is notice that it's not starting on the midline. So, cosine or sine? What is the midline? What is your amplitude? Okay. So figure those out. Take a minute, look at your graph, figure out where the period ends. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to pause it and try and get your answer, and then come back and see if your answers match. Okay, before I give you the answer, I wanted to see if what you have matched what I got. I noticed that we started here, above or top, middle, bottom, middle, top, and then it starts to repeat itself. So there's where my period ends. So it ends at 1440. My midline, I can tell between the bottom and the top, halfway between, is at -2. So k is equal to -2. And because it started off the midline, it started at top, middle, bottom, top, middle, top, I know it's cosine. And my period gave me my value for b, because we're doing degrees. We take 360 divided by b equals my period. And if I solve that, I end up with 1/4. So see if you got all those same answers, and then go ahead and pause and see if your answer, finish writing your equation if you made a mistake here. Okay, so here is what I got for my equation. I put my amplitude here, and instead of 1/4 times theta, it's more common to write theta over 4. theta divided by 4, and then minus 2 because that was your value for k. All right, last example. Again, and this is in radians. So here we're going to do this one in radians. And in case you can't see it, it's pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, 5 pi, and so on, all the way up to 9 pi. So go ahead and take a look at that. Pause your video, see if you can identify all the important pieces, and then can you write your equation. I'm going to identify the pieces, and then you can look at that piece, and then pause it again and look at your... Okay, so did you get the information I got here? I have not written the equation yet, but I have gained some information. I gained that our amplitude was 3, so A is equal to 3. I gained that this distance from here to here is 6, so halfway in between would bring me to 1. So that means that my midline is y equals 1. And since it's y equals 1, then I know that k is equal to 1. I saw that I started here at the midline, so middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. So there's my period at 6 pi. Finding that, I divided 2 pi by b, and I know it should equal 6 pi. And when I calculated that, I got b is equal to 1/3. Noticing that my graph starts on the midline, I know, is it sine or cosine? If it starts on the midline, it's going to be sine. So I was able to determine all of that information. So if yours matched, go ahead and pause and write your equation. If it did not match, go ahead and go back and make those adjustments and write your equation before you take a look at what the answer is. Okay, so there is my answer. See if it matches yours. Again, just to quickly walk through, y is equal to the amplitude, or A, which is 3, sine, because we knew it started on, then it's 1/3 times theta, but we write that as theta divided by 3, and then plus your k value, which is 1. And that is it. So there's some examples for you. Hopefully that helps you with your homework, and have fun doing your